First, let me thank the Friends of the Canadian War Museum for hosting my talk today about boosters and barkers, financing Canada's involvement in the First World War, published by the University of British Columbia Press as part of this museum's Studies in Canadian Military History series. The museum's support is much appreciated, as is that today of Captain Louise Sue. My talk should last about 45 minutes. Some images may be appearing in the course of that. If not, I will tell you what they should look like. So we'll hope for the best. But before I begin, let me ask you this. And I say this looking around, judging some ages. Do any of you remember Canada savings bonds from the 1950s and 60s?
No.
You're not sure. Would anybody care to tell me what they were and why you know about them, why you might have bought one? Would anyone stand up and give us a thumbnail sketch? What was a Canada savings bond? I need a volunteer here. Sir, in the back?
It's more saving and minimal interest.
Savings and minimal interest. Does anybody else care to add to that who might have bought?
It was fun to clip them.
It was fun to
It
clip.
was fun to clip them, right?
Clip the interest coupons off the bond, and you got your low interest rate. So I want you to keep that experience in mind because it's relevant today. Back to the book. Canada's participation in the First World War came at horrendous human cost, nearly 61,000 killed and another 72,000 injured. A sacrifice that has become fixed in our collective memory. And you only have to walk around this museum to understand what that means. But there was another cost, a financial one, which has received much less attention. Economists at the time of the war and in advance of the Second World War looked at this. More recently, historians such as the late Ian Drummond in Toronto and Tim Cook of this museum, and the shop has many of his books, all of them I would think. These touch on wartime finance. But my goal in this book is to expand our view of finance in an interdisciplinary manner, building on an in-depth examination of government accounts and actions. That's the bedrock of boosters and barkers, but I don't want to talk to you about treasury bills, interest coupons, interest rates, and so on. That would be mind-numbing, I think, and hard to explain in less than 3 days. And I'll explain the title, Boosters and Barkers, in a few minutes. It's neither conventional military history nor economic history, but it progresses through 5 parts, and I'll tell you about them now. Part 1, which is heavily evidence-based, details the fundamental task of getting the money to fund the ever-escalating costs of a never-ending war in Europe and operations at home at the same time, including a beleaguered railway system, navigating the shoals of conscription and highly divisive politics, and adjusting to post-war realities after the armistice of 1918. Before the war, Canada drew upon conventional sources of revenue, mainly customs and excise duties. From the start of the war, Finance Minister Thomas White, who hadn't been prepared for this when he was brought into government as an outsider in 1911, he had a simple mandate in 1914, get the money. It's that simple. As costs escalated and the war dragged on, new approaches had to be found. Like most belligerents, Canada resorted to borrowing from Britain early in the war, from banks, and most notably from the public through 6 war loans, where during campaigns of a few weeks' duration, Canadians were asked to subscribe, that is, to buy, bonds with fixed maturities and rates of return. To many, the concept of subscribing to a bond was foreign. People were wondering, what is a bond? People understood what a dollar bill was, what coins were, what mortgages were, but what is a bond? What developed was a continuing of federal allocations of funds and national loans, with bridging from temporary loans, debenture stock, treasury bills, and savings stamps and certificates. Even with annual budgets, Thomas White seldom had finance in place for more than 4 months ahead, at a time when no one knew how long the war would last or what it would cost. In 1915, the Dominion War Loan created a template. That year, Canada and Britain entered into a novel reciprocal funding arrangement, whereby, in simple terms, Britain paid our soldiers overseas in exchange for Canadian funding of munitions and food productions here. When Britain's needs, built through the Canadian Imperial Munitions Board, Canadian-based, that is, it's an imperial body, built to crisis proportions in 1917, Canada set the wheels in motion for its first victory loan. Not a Dominion War loan, but its first victory loan in the fall of 1917. It was an extraordinary hard sell, characterized by all manner of publicity, the sometimes tense coordination of the press, vital bank loans, marketing experts bent on selling bonds like pickles and margarine. There was also the influenza pandemic and coercion to boost investment in bonds and seeking to sell Canadians on a remote war. You have to imagine that it's over there, it's across the Atlantic, it's in Europe. Even though our sons are going over there, and we often heard the sons coming back or writing letters, what was it like? Most Canadians didn't fully understand. Throughout all this, one sees the determination of Thomas White, the finance minister, despite debilitating pressures to retain control of the financial levers. One historian called Thomas White a one-man show of finance. Perspective, I follow the development of the securities field. From a business perspective, I follow the development of the securities field as war bonds flooded the marketplace to the point where the government implemented stabilizing controls. I'm also conscious, as I was doing this work, of how companies and corporations, when called upon to subscribe, responded with enthusiasm while prudently managing their assets. Now, I may be repetitive here, but I don't want to leave you in the dark. Do you understand what I mean by subscribing to a war bond? You're buying one for a fixed period of time, denominations starting at $50, going up to several $1,000s. Now, put this in today's terms. A $50 bond in 1918 would cost you over $875 today. I don't know about you, but I'd have to give serious thought to putting that kind of money into an investment security when it costs that much. Part 2 of the book traces the 6 war loans across the country, urban and rural, orchestrated by a national publicity machine with a compendium of solicitations from door-to-door canvassing to mass distributions of pamphlets measured not in numbers, but in tonnages and dozens of different languages. I strive to see local developments as part of a national picture. This was a challenge for me at the outset. I could see what was happening in one community, but I was asking myself, when I say, is this a feasible project? What was happening across the country in other communities, including French-speaking Quebec and Newfoundland. Now, at the time, of course, Newfoundland was a separate dominion, but I call, as I'll say in a few minutes, the Newfoundland section, I call it the Canadian Connection, and I'll explain that then. The Dominion War loans of 1915, 1916, and early 1917 set financial agendas while publicly answering some simple questions as, what is a bond? The newly named victory loans of 1917, 18, and 19 were focused on orchestrated campaigns of a few weeks' duration, shaped by tight financial cycles facing the government as well as market factors. Many campaigns resembled street carnivals, prompting one veteran soldier to bemoan all this carnival-esque activity. It's just a whole bunch of boosters, barkers, and spielers, hence the title of my book. Women and children were prime targets. The ideologies of Christianity and thrift to save to buy bonds, and the inducement of entertainment loomed large, where in films, in vaudeville halls, there would be promotions, speakers, and film clips, and short silent films, which I'll talk about in a few minutes too. The biggest achievements of the publicity machine may well have been the education of Canadians about investment in war bonds and their seismic landing in society, where they became lodged in the public's imagination. A quarter to a third of subscription came from what they called the big subscribers, many of them solicited behind the scenes. By definitions of big could be anywhere from $1,000 to $50,000. There was no consistency in how that was described. Economists did weigh in, some on consequences of long-term national debt, others on the inequalities inherent in security investment. At the same time, a scarcity of records, as I discovered, makes detailed social analysis very difficult. Photographs require interpretation. Now, Louise, are we ready to show any figures? Louise, so that I'm not doing a rapid fire. List of coast-to-coast examination, I moved from part 2 to part 3, which I call Newfoundland and the Canadian Connection. This takes us to the Rock, then a separate dominion, as I've said. With a much smaller population, it had one public war loan in 1918, which was centered in St. John's, but was heavily dependent on the sale of bonds through a Toronto syndicate, hence the Canadian connection. Government finances tracked in this part, but a comprehensive account of the loan campaign was confounded for me by underreporting in the island's few newspapers, particularly on the results from small towns and inputs. We didn't have provincial, county, municipal organization. It worked differently. But what is clear is Newfoundland's use of loan expertise and financing from Canadian, British, and American sources that I was familiar with. Part 4 of the book probes consensus and resistance. Not every Canadian understood the concept of bonds or bought into professions of an imagined Canadian commonality. Where investment value was paramount, subscription did not necessarily mean support for the war. There was inability to subscribe because of limited means, ill health, cynicism, political and conscientious aversion, and misgivings about spiral national debt. At a time when Ottawa, the financial department, was trying to deal with what one historians call as the Canadian Northern Railway mess, which was starting to go towards bankruptcy, but they couldn't let it fail. Shades of patriotism are exposed. In Quebec, reflecting public sentiment, a newspaperman, Henri Bourassa, an ardent opponent of an imperial war and a victory loan skeptic, came to endorse bonds within days of the armistice as a nationalist obligation to reconstruction. Ethnic, religious, and labor sectors responded and reacted. In 1918, an engineer in British Columbia had this to say of workers: "They are patriots when they boost the victory loan and alien enemies when they strike for fair working conditions." Anti-German sentiment was rampant. Coercion could be seen everywhere, whether it was at factory gates, in vaudeville halls, including one case, and I talk about this in the book, and I'm going to read from it, involving a fatal shooting. On November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day, with anti-German sentiment rampant, a boisterous group celebrating the armistice in Drumheller, Alberta, turned into a mob. They had been driving around in high spirits in all respects and had gone to a cafe to sign bond papers and kiss the Union Jack. They then decided to terrorize German-born residents of the area, said to have refused to support the victory loan and the Red Cross. After taking 2 of them to a pool room and compelling them to buy bonds and apologize for their national origins, the gang, not all of them official bond salesmen, drove off into the countryside looking for a target. After forcing subscriptions from an elderly farmer and his son, the pack, led by one Edward Blaine, a barber, arrived at the farmhouse of Albert Arnold, a single 35-year-old native of Germany and reportedly an army officer there. He had come to Canada and was naturalized in 1914, although to the drumheller he was still a Hun. According to a neighbor, one of the gang shouted in reply to Arnold's call as to what they wanted, said, "We've got you now, you son of a bitch." After stoning the house and then knocking but receiving no answer, they entered. When Blaine, who was wrapped in a Union Jack, approached an inner door, he was shot by a terrified Arnold and killed. The rest of the party fled, but would later return for Blaine's body, at which point Arnold bolted. He gave himself up the next morning. At his trial for murder in January, it was heard that he had acted in self-defense. He was acquitted. Thank goodness for the historians. We have court records and newspaper reports on that. It's not hearsay. Part 5 of the book, the final part, deconstructs war loan propaganda into complementary components. The visual imagery, including posters and films, the parades and music, what one Nova Scotia newspaper called noise propaganda, and literature, both official and unofficial. This is where my interdisciplinary approach comes out in particular. With varying degrees of effectiveness, these means, which the public could seldom avoid, but could filter, created the educational atmosphere marketeers believed was vital to sell war bonds and the need to support the war. The word atmosphere was used repeatedly. It wasn't a one-time sighting, a one-time encounter with a canvasser. It's what you would see on a day-to-day basis walking to work, posters on fences, people trying to get you to give part of your wages, to this. So it was hard to avoid, particularly in the cities. In the country, the campaigns were more spread out. In the Alberta foothills, there's a guy, a doctor, with a horse and cart, and he would take weeks going around. In one area of northern Leeds County, where I'm from, you may know the town of Athens, a Victory Loan committee, very small, got 3 musicians from the local Red Cross and hit the road. And they did the little places that I'm familiar with called Phillipsville, Harlem, and so on. And they would go into community halls. The band, such as it was, would create a little bit of atmosphere, and try and keep people's interest. So this is, in all these spheres, these different campaigns, these different communities, this is where propaganda can be seen as the business of marketing, creating the climate needed to stimulate subscriptions and sustain interest year-round, just as Canadians were being bombarded with calls to donate their nickels and dimes to a plethora of causes, not to mention recruitment appeals. I examined posters, cartoons, and film in this context. Whether surrounded by familiar music hall fare and theatrical promotions, the sounds of the war loan are much harder to convey or replicate. We're going to hear that Victory Loan chorus that was set up a few minutes ago, but not yet, not yet, not yet. Here is one attempt drawn from a published score that exhorted Canadians to rush to their pianos. Can we run the Victory Loan chorus?
Yeah.
This was promoted, this was published in a newspaper, and everybody was urged to take it to their local, to their family piano. Every third household at the time had a piano, I'm told. And the newspaper said, oh, this little item has swing. That was the word. As you'll hear from the audio, it may strike your ears differently. We're not going to hear all of it because it goes on for a few choruses. But after one or two, and I'll tell you when to stop, you'll get the idea. This was put together for me by a musician historian friend in British Columbia. I sent him that score from the newspaper. I said, what do I do with this? And this is what he did with it. Okay, I think you've heard enough to get the idea. Some propaganda flopped. As was the case with a number of publicity initiatives, I found no evidence that this course caught on. But there was sound in assembly halls, in vaudeville performances, along parade routes, all of which dissipated after the war, especially at the time of the armistice, which overlapped with the Victory Loan campaign of November, December. All the organizers were fearful, the war is over, the campaign's going to flop. But then the organizers quickly transitioned, but we have to bring the boys home. So that's what the Victory Loans became at the end of 1918 and into 19, demobilization. So all these sounds dissipated after the war. Things like Long, Long Way to Tipperary survived. We're familiar with that. In the print sector, sanctioned articles, countless editorials, pamphlets in the hundreds of thousands in different languages, and essays all expanded the atmosphere, as did candid letters from public and soldiers. From Saskatchewan, in February 1919, an 11-year-old wrote to the children's section of a Winnipeg newspaper that he had grown wheat on a patch on the family farm. Plus, he wrote, I was in the Boys and Girls Pig Contest this summer and I got 7th prize. The prize was $4. I bought a $50 victory bond with my money. I have a brother that enlisted in 1916. He was killed in action on October 30th. He was 25 years old. Signed, Kenneth Lyon. Every time I read that letter, I was stunned by this boy's consciousness in one simple letter to a newspaper of a victory bond and his brother's death. No clear connection, but in his mind, this was part of the war. How people responded adds immeasurably to our grasp of finance. Again, interdisciplinary. How did people respond when they saw a poster, when they heard the song? I'm not, after all these years, clear on reading people's minds, and never will be. But human voices are repeatedly drawn into boosters and barkers, where ideology, investment, and everyday life are interwoven. Part 5 is followed by some conclusions. By the time of the armistice of 1918, and into months of demobilization, when 1919 emerged as Canada's most expensive war year, and that's what they called it, another war year, but with fading enthusiasms. Added by one more victory loan in late 1919, the government got the money it needed. As can be seen in my account of Canada's finance, the war loans produced nearly a third of the country's war cost, which was estimated at $6.6 billion. Much, much less than World War II. In 1940, during the Second War, one journalist called the loans during the Great War, quote, the greatest mass-selling performances ever achieved in Canada. But that achievement was not attained without long-term financial consequences, which I follow in the book. Degrees of federal intervention in the economy, new levels of national debt, war taxes that became permanent, such as the war income tax, which we now deal with every year as part of our income tax routines. New levels of national debt, securities market that was reshaped, the repayment of war loans as they became due, and their refinancing into the 1940s. War loans, when they expired, were refinanced. That's another way of saying refunded, so that they continued and the government didn't have to pay out massively at the end of it. They just kept rolling them over into the 1940s. This was at a time when World War II war loans were taking shape. So that's boosters and barkers. I hope this talk gives you some idea of the potential in seeing war finance through a wide lens. Now, before I get to questions and answers, we're going to do our best on pictures.